Griffith Park has always had an allure. Something about the sprawling trails, the breathtaking views, and the eerie quietness once you leave the crowds behind. It's a place of contrasts. By day, it's bustling with families, hikers, and tourists snapping selfies. By night, it transforms into something entirely different. Something darker. I'd heard rumors about the park's haunted spots, phantom figures, unsettling sounds, inexplicable lights. They were the kind of stories you laugh about with friends but never take seriously. At least, not until you experience them for yourself. I've always considered myself a skeptic. Ghosts, urban legends, paranormal activity, it all felt like nonsense. But I had a fascination with testing the limits of fear, pushing myself to explore places others might avoid. That's how I found myself at the trailhead of Griffith Park's old zoo on a cold December night in 2020, armed with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and my best friend Matt. "Dude, this is so dumb," Matt muttered as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. "You know, this is just an excuse for people to scare themselves, right? There's nothing out here." "Exactly," I replied, smirking as I adjusted my camera settings. "And we're about to prove it. Imagine how many views we'll get when we post this." Matt rolled his eyes. "Yeah, because people are just dying to watch two idiots walk around in the dark." Despite his sarcasm, I could tell Matt was nervous. The way he kept glancing over his shoulder and fidgeting with his flashlight gave him away. I didn't blame him. The park at night was a completely different beast. The once picturesque trails were now cloaked in shadows, the dense trees forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine, even though I told myself it was just the wind or a squirrel. The first part of the hike was uneventful. We followed the main trail, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we made small talk to pass the time. The city lights of Los Angeles glittered in the distance, a reminder that we weren't entirely isolated. But the further we went, the quieter it became. The sounds of distant cars and laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow our voices. "I don't like this," Matt said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's there to not like?" I teased, aiming my flashlight at a nearby tree to exaggerate the shadows. "It's just a bunch of trees and dirt." "Yeah, but it's too quiet," he replied, stopping to look around. "Shouldn't there be like crickets or something? Birds? Anything?" I hadn't noticed it before, but he was right. The usual background noise of nocturnal wildlife was conspicuously absent. No chirping, no rustling, just silence. "Maybe the animals don't like the cold," I said, shrugging. "Or maybe they know something we don't," Matt muttered. We pressed on, the trail narrowing as we approached the abandoned animal enclosures of the old zoo. This was the part I'd been most excited about. The old zoo was infamous among ghost hunters and urban explorers, a relic of the past that had been left to decay. The cages, once home to exotic animals, were now empty, overgrown with vines and graffiti covered. It was the perfect setting for a spooky adventure. As we stepped into the clearing, I pulled out my camera and started recording. "All right, guys," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the open space. "We're here at Griffith Park's old zoo, a place that's rumored to be one of the most haunted spots in Los Angeles. Let's see if we can find anything to back that up." Matt wandered off to explore one of the enclosures while I focused on the eerie structures. The cages looked even more unsettling in the dim light, their bars twisted and rusted from years of neglect. I zoomed in on a particularly creepy cage, the graffiti on its walls forming strange, almost ritualistic patterns. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow that moved across the edge of my lens. But when I panned the camera back, it was gone. "Matt," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "What?" he asked, appearing from behind a nearby wall. "Come here," I said, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen the shadow. "What is it?" he asked, jogging over. "There was something, I don't know, something moving," I said, pointing to the screen. Matt peered over my shoulder, squinting at the screen. "I don't see anything," he said. "It was there," I insisted. "I swear." Matt laughed nervously. "You're already scaring yourself. Let's keep moving." As we continued exploring the area, the unease grew. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Do you hear that?" Matt asked suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Sho," he said, holding up a hand. I strained to listen, and then I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, low and mournful. "Hello," Matt called out, his voice shaking. The whispering stopped. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We hurried back to the main trail, our flashlights flickering as we moved. The path seemed darker now, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. My hands were clammy, my pulse racing. As we reached a fork in the trail, I paused to catch my breath. "We're fine," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Matt. "It's just..." A loud crack interrupted me, followed by a rustling sound in the bushes. "What the hell was that?" Matt whispered, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. We stood frozen, our flashlights trained on the bushes. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a shadow emerged, a figure, barely visible, standing just beyond the edge of the light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there motionless, watching us. "Let's go," Matt said, grabbing my arm. We backed away slowly, our eyes never leaving the figure. But as we turned to run, the whispering returned, louder this time, and impossibly close. We pushed forward on the trail, but everything felt off. The silence wasn't natural. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, like you were in a vacuum where even the sound of your own breathing felt too loud. The only thing breaking the monotony was the crunch of our boots against the dirt path, but even that seemed muted. "I don't like this, Ethan," Matt said again, his voice trembling slightly. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his flashlight bouncing erratically as his hand shook. "That whisper, I swear it wasn't just the wind." "I know," I admitted. The bravado I'd started with was gone now. I was as scared as he was, but I didn't want to say it. Instead, I focused on my camera, hoping to distract myself by capturing anything I could. We followed the narrow trail until it opened into a clearing. In the middle stood an old structure, half hidden by overgrown bushes and ivy. It looked like a maintenance shed, but it was larger than I expected, with its metal siding rusted and streaked with black. "This must have been part of the zoo," I said, stepping closer. My flashlight revealed faded graffiti on the walls, some of it crude, but some of it strange. Symbols and shapes that didn't look like the typical vandalism you'd see in the city. Matt stayed back, his flashlight aimed at the surrounding trees. "Why do I feel like we shouldn't go in there?" "Because we probably shouldn't," I muttered. But curiosity got the better of me. I approached the shed and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing into the darkness inside. My flashlight revealed a large, empty space with concrete floors and walls. The air inside was freezing, far colder than it had any right to be. My breath fogged up as I stepped in. "Ethan, don't," Matt hissed from outside. "It's fine," I said, trying to sound confident. The shed was empty, or so it seemed. There were a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. A chair missing a leg, a table covered in dust, but nothing else of note. Still, the atmosphere was oppressive, like the air was thicker here, heavier. And then, as I panned my flashlight across the room, I saw it. A shadow moved across the far wall. It was quick, darting out of sight before I could focus on it. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, gripping my flashlight tightly. "Matt," I called out, my voice shaking. "What?" he said from outside. "There's something in here," I whispered. "What do you mean, something?" Matt's voice was rising now. "I don't know," I said, taking a step back toward the door. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from deeper inside the shed. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. "Get out of there!" Matt yelled. I turned and bolted out of the shed, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. "What did you see?" Matt demanded, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I said. "A shadow. Footsteps. Something was in there, Matt." Before he could respond, we heard it. The sound of the door creaking open behind us. We spun around, our flashlights aimed at the shed. The door was now ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. But there was no one there, and then the whispering returned. This time it was louder, clearer, and unmistakable. It wasn't just random sounds, it was words. "Leave now," the voice said, guttural and low, as if spoken by someone right behind us. We didn't need any more convincing. We ran. My flashlight bounced wildly with every step, its beam flickering as if it was about to die. Matt was ahead of me, his breathing ragged, his boots kicking up dirt as he sprinted. The trail, which had been so familiar on the way in, now felt alien, twisting in ways I didn't remember, the trees pressing closer together, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. "We're almost there," Matt yelled, but his voice didn't carry the conviction I hoped for. I wanted to believe him, but the whispering hadn't stopped. It was everywhere now, surrounding us, growing louder and more insistent. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. Anger. The path opened into another clearing. This one was smaller, encircled by dense trees that blocked out the moonlight entirely. We stopped to catch our breath, and for a brief moment, the whispering stopped too. "Did we lose it?" I asked, clutching my knees as I tried to steady my breathing. Matt shook his head, his eyes scanning the darkness. "I don't think it's something you can lose." The clearing was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence so deep it made my ears ring. My flashlight, already dim, began to flicker more erratically, and then it went out completely. "Matt," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. "I'm here," he said, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the ring of light cast by Matt's flashlight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs long and crooked, its face obscured by shadow. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Matt didn't answer. He was frozen, his flashlight fixed on the figure. The figure moved, not toward us, but around the edge of the clearing, staying just beyond the light. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "Run," Matt said, his voice barely audible. We turned and bolted back the way we came, but the trail was gone. The path we had followed was now a tangle of roots and undergrowth, impossible to navigate. We pushed through the foliage, branches scratching at our faces and arms, the whispering growing louder with every step. I glanced back and saw the figure again, closer this time. Its head tilted to one side as if studying us. Its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Matt, go!" I screamed, shoving him forward. We burst through the trees and onto a narrow trail that hadn't been there before. I didn't question it. I just ran, following Matt as the whispers gave way to something worse. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pounded the ground behind us, faster than they should have been. My chest burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. The trail twisted and turned, the shadows closing in, until we saw it, a faint light in the distance. The light turned out to be a lantern hanging from the branch of a dead tree. Beneath it was an old wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. I squinted to read the words carved into the wood. "No trespassing. Leave this place." "We've been going in circles," Matt said, his voice breaking. "We're back where we started." He was right. The lantern, the tree, the sign, it was the same clearing we had passed on our way to the abandoned zoo. But something was different now. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and the whispering had changed. It wasn't just words anymore. It was laughter. High-pitched, childlike laughter echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trees and making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The laughter stopped abruptly, and then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." It was the same voice we had heard before, low, guttural, and dripping with malice. But now it was close, far too close. I spun around, shining my flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Matt grabbed my arm. "We have to go," he said, his eyes wide with terror. We turned back toward the trail, but it was gone again, swallowed by the forest. The only way forward was deeper into the clearing, toward the dead tree. As we approached it, the lantern flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, I felt something brush against my arm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Matt!" I whispered, but Matt didn't respond. When I turned to look for him, he was gone. "Matt!" I shouted, my voice echoing into the void. The whispering returned, louder than ever, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stumbled back, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, but it barely cut through the darkness. "Ethan." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was Matt's. I turned toward the sound and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. "Matt!" I ran toward him, but as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. "Ethan," he said again, but his lips didn't move. And then I saw it, the shadow behind him, stretching unnaturally across the ground, its long, crooked limbs merging with his. "Run," he whispered, his voice no longer his own. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, my flashlight flickering with every step. The whispers followed me, growing louder and angrier, until they were a deafening roar. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst onto the main trail. The city lights were visible now, faint but real, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot. My car was the only one there, its windows fogged up from the cold. I jumped in, locking the doors and starting the engine with trembling hands. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. Matt was never found. Los Angeles is a city of dreams, but beneath its glimmering skyline lies a labyrinth of secrets. The underground tunnels, once used for Prohibition-era smuggling, secret meetings, and even Cold War bunkers, have long been a source of fascination for urban explorers. I wasn't one of them, at least not until my friend Jake invited me on an exclusive tour of a part of the tunnels he swore no one had seen before. "You're going to love this," Jake said over the phone, his voice brimming with excitement. "These aren't the ones they take tourists to. This is the real deal." I hesitated. Jake was known for his reckless ideas, and while I appreciated his adventurous spirit, I wasn't keen on crawling through dark, forgotten spaces. "Come on, Sarah," he pleaded. "You're always saying you want to try something different. This is your chance." Against my better judgment, I agreed. That Saturday evening, I met Jake and his friend Marcos at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of downtown. The building was crumbling, its windows shattered, and graffiti covered every surface. Jake had a crowbar slung over his shoulder, and Marcos carried a heavy-duty flashlight. "This is it," Jake said, grinning as he pried open a rusted metal door. Behind it was a staircase leading down into darkness. The air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of damp concrete. "You sure about this?" I asked, peering into the void. Jake laughed. "It's just a tunnel. What's the worst that could happen?" We descended the staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. At the bottom, the tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, lit only by the faint beams of our flashlights. "This way," Jake said, taking the lead. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The tunnel was silent except for the occasional drip of water, but the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I brushed it off as nerves, determined not to let Jake and Marcos see how uneasy I was. After about 15 minutes, we reached a fork in the tunnel. Jake stopped, glancing at his phone. "What's wrong?" Marcos asked. Jake frowned. "The map says left, but I don't remember this fork being here last time." "What do you mean last time?" I asked. Jake hesitated. I might have come down here before. Alone." I glared at him. "And you didn't think to mention that?" Before Jake could answer, a low, distant hum echoed through the tunnel. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. "What the hell was that?" Marcos asked, shining his flashlight in both directions. Jake shrugged, trying to look unfazed. Probably just the pipes. But as we took the left tunnel, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just made a mistake. The left tunnel was colder. I didn't know how that was possible, but I felt the drop in temperature the moment we stepped into it. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness ahead, and the echoes of our footsteps seemed wrong. Too sharp, too loud, as though the tunnel itself was amplifying every sound. Jake was in high spirits, leading the way with his phone in hand, the faint glow of its map app reflecting off the damp walls. Marcos walked behind him, holding his flashlight like a weapon, his free hand grazing the rough wall as if to anchor himself. I brought up the rear, hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked, my voice low to avoid disturbing the oppressive quiet. Jake grinned over his shoulder. "A hidden chamber. I found some old plans online. These tunnels were supposed to connect to a secret storage room, maybe even a fallout shelter. If we're lucky, it's still intact, or it's collapsed and we're wasting our time," Marcos muttered. Jake ignored him, pressing on. The hum we'd heard earlier returned, louder this time. It wasn't constant, but rhythmic, like something breathing. "Okay, what is that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Jake and Marcos paused, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The hum seemed to be coming from ahead, faintly reverberating through the walls. "Probably just air moving through the pipes," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Marcos shook his head. "There's no airflow down here. That's not air." We exchanged uneasy glances before continuing. The hum grew louder as we walked, eventually joined by something else. A faint murmur, like voices whispering just out of earshot. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding. Jake nodded, his grin finally faltering. "Yeah, I hear it." We rounded a corner, and the tunnel widened into a larger space. The floor was uneven, littered with debris, broken pipes, crumbled concrete, and what looked like the remains of old equipment. In the center of the room stood a metal hatch, its surface streaked with rust. "That's it," Jake said, his excitement returning. "That's the chamber." The murmur was louder now, coming from below the hatch. It wasn't in English or any language I recognized. The words were guttural, overlapping, and unnatural. "You sure about this?" Marcos asked, gripping his flashlight tighter. Jake shrugged. "Only one way to find out." He knelt by the hatch and began pulling at its rusted handle. It groaned in protest, but didn't budge. "Help me out here," Jake said, motioning for Marcos to join him. I stayed back, my flashlight trained on the hatch as the two of them worked. The whispers grew louder, almost urgent, as though they were warning us not to continue. "Maybe we shouldn't," I started, but it was too late. With a final heave, Jake and Marcos pried the hatch open. The voices stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, from the darkness below, came a sound I will never forget. A guttural scream that echoed through the chamber, raw and inhuman. Jake's face had lost all its color. He stared at the hatch as though expecting something to emerge. Marcos was already backing away, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "We should close it," I said, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Jake shook his head. "We came this far. We can't turn back now." Before I could stop him, he shone his flashlight into the opening. A steep metal ladder descended into the darkness, the rungs corroded and slick with moisture. "I'll go first," Jake said, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "You're insane," Marcos hissed. Jake ignored him, lowering himself onto the ladder. His flashlight beam bobbed as he descended, eventually swallowed by the black void below. "Jake!" I called out after a few moments. "I'm fine," his voice echoed back. "It's not that deep. Come on down." Marcos cursed under his breath, but followed. I had no choice but to go after them, gripping the cold, slimy rungs as I climbed down. The air grew colder with every step, the metallic smell intensifying. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with strange symbols etched into the stone, their shapes jagged and alien. The air was heavy, thick with an almost tangible sense of wrongness. "What is this place?" Marcos whispered, his flashlight sweeping over the walls. Jake didn't answer. He was fixated on a doorway at the end of the corridor, its frame carved with the same symbols. Beyond it was another room, bathed in a faint, pulsating red light. "We shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling. Jake turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We've come this far. We need to see what's inside." The room beyond the doorway was circular, its walls covered in more of the strange carvings. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it was a black stone orb, its surface swirling with faint red patterns. Jake approached the orb, his eyes wide with fascination. "Do you see this?" he whispered, reaching out to touch it. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the orb, the red patterns flared, filling the room with blinding light. A deafening roar erupted, shaking the walls and knocking us off our feet. When the light faded, the orb was gone. In its place stood a figure, tall, featureless, and wreathed in shadow. Its presence was suffocating, its hollow gaze fixed on Jake. "You were warned," it said, its voice echoing inside my head. Jake tried to move, but the figure raised a hand, and he froze in place. Marcos and I could only watch in horror as the shadows around Jake deepened, consuming him entirely. Marcos and I bolted. The corridor twisted and turned as if the tunnel itself was alive, trying to trap us. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, casting eerie patterns across our faces. The whispers were back, louder than ever, overlapping and echoing until they became a cacophony. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. When we reached the ladder, Marcos climbed first, his movements frantic. I followed, feeling the shadows clawing at my heels. The scream from earlier returned, shaking the walls and sending chunks of debris raining down. We burst into the main tunnel, slamming the hatch shut behind us. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jake was gone. The tunnel was gone. The opening we had entered from was now a solid wall of stone. Marcos and I never spoke about what happened that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again. Point Reyes has always been known for its rugged beauty, a place where the Pacific meets jagged cliffs under an endless expanse of sky. But the lighthouse perched at its farthest edge holds a darker reputation, one that most visitors don't hear about. It's whispered about in local legends, stories of sailors lost to the rocks, of strange lights at sea, and of disappearances near the foggy cliffs. I came to Point Reyes on assignment. As a freelance journalist, I'd been working on a series about California's historic lighthouses. Most of my work was routine: interviews with caretakers, photographs of crumbling structures, and stories of forgotten maritime heroes. But Point Reyes was different. The stories I'd heard about this place weren't just about history. They were about the unexplained. When I arrived late in the afternoon, the wind was howling, whipping through the cliffs with enough force to make the parked car tremble. The sky was overcast, thick clouds rolling in from the horizon, and the air carried the distinct smell of salt and seaweed. The lighthouse stood like a sentinel at the edge of the world. It was smaller than I'd imagined, but somehow more imposing, with its whitewashed walls streaked with grime and the glass lantern room glinting faintly in the fading light. The caretaker, Gerald, was waiting for me at the visitor center, a weathered man with a face like a storm-worn cliff. He didn't look pleased to see me. "You must be the reporter," he said, squinting at me as if I'd already inconvenienced him. "That's me," I replied, trying to keep it friendly. "Daniel Cooper. Thanks for agreeing to let me take a look around." He grunted. "Didn't agree to much. You'll get your tour, but don't expect me to hold your hand. Just stay close and don't wander off. The fog's no joke around here." We made our way down the steep staircase leading to the lighthouse, the wind tugging at my jacket. Gerald moved with the ease of someone who'd walked this path 1,000 times, while I had to grip the railing to keep from losing my footing. The inside of the lighthouse was as weathered as the outside. The walls were damp, the air heavy with the smell of salt and rust. Gerald showed me the Fresnel lens, a magnificent, multifaceted piece of glass that had guided countless ships to safety, and the old keeper's logbooks, their pages yellowed and brittle. "This place has seen its fair share of history," I said, running my fingers over the edge of one of the logbooks. Gerald snorted. "History, sure, but there's more to it than that. You'll see." I raised an eyebrow. "More to it?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the spiral staircase that led up to the lantern room. "There are things about this place you don't put in articles. Things people wouldn't believe even if you did." Before I could press him, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the cliffs and turning the ocean into a vast, gray void. Gerald frowned. "Looks like you'll be staying the night. Hope you brought a flashlight." After Gerald left me in the guest quarters, I unpacked my gear and set up my laptop on the small wooden desk by the window. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed with a thin blanket, a chair that creaked ominously when I sat down, and an oil lamp perched on a shelf. The window offered a view of the ocean, but the fog was so thick I could barely make out the faint glow of the lantern room above. I spent the next couple of hours reviewing my notes and photographs from the other lighthouses I'd visited. The rhythmic crash of waves against the cliffs was almost soothing, a constant backdrop that made the isolation feel less severe. But as the night wore on, the comforting sound began to change. The waves sounded sharper, angrier, as if something was disturbing the water. I dismissed it as the tide changing, but then I heard the knocking. It was faint at first, a soft, irregular tap against the wooden walls of the room. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The smell of seaweed hit me immediately, sharp and overwhelming. I shone the beam of light down the corridor, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching toward the spiral staircase that led to the lantern room. "Gerald?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The knocking came again, but now it was coming from above, from the lantern room. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. But curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the spiral staircase slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder the higher I went, and by the time I reached the top, I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. The lantern room was empty. The Fresnel lens stood in the center, its intricate glass panels catching the faint glow from the oil lamp I carried. But the knocking had stopped, replaced by something worse, a faint whispering just on the edge of hearing. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight at the walls and windows, but I couldn't find the source. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I backed toward the staircase, my heart pounding, when I noticed something on the glass of the lens. A single handprint, smeared as if someone had pressed their palm against it and dragged it downward. I stumbled back down the staircase, nearly tripping in my haste. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the bottom, the air was thick with the smell of seaweed, and the fog outside the windows seemed to pulse like something alive. Gerald was waiting for me in the main room, his expression grim. "You heard them, didn't you?" I nodded, my throat dry. "What's going on here? Who's out there?" He sighed heavily, sitting down at the old wooden table. This lighthouse wasn't built to guide ships. Not originally. It was built to keep something out. The locals used to call them the Watchers, things that live in the fog. They've been here longer than any of us. Before I could respond, the room went dark. The oil lamps flickered out one by one, leaving us in complete darkness. The only light came from my flashlight, which barely pierced the heavy shadows. Then we heard it, a loud, guttural knock on the door. Gerald grabbed an oil lamp, fumbling to relight it. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The knock came again, louder this time. The door creaked, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't locked. The fog outside pressed against the windows, and as Gerald relit the lamp, I saw something move, a shadow passing through the mist. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong, too tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. The knock came a third time, and this time, the door opened on its own. The figure stepped into the room, its form barely visible through the fog that seemed to seep in with it. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Gerald stood frozen, his lamp shaking in his hand. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, without warning, it lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. Gerald cried out as the lamp shattered, plunging the room into darkness. I ran. I don't know how I made it to the staircase, but I found myself climbing, my flashlight flickering as I ascended. The whispers were back, louder and more chaotic, and I could feel the presence following me, its cold breath on the back of my neck. When I reached the lantern room, the door slammed shut behind me. The Fresnel lens was glowing now, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The fog outside was alive with movement, shadows circling the lighthouse, their forms merging and separating in an endless, nightmarish dance. The whispers reached a crescendo, and the lantern room shook violently. The glass cracked, and I realized too late that the light wasn't keeping the watchers out. It was calling them in. The room was collapsing around me. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the cracks in the glass spread like spiderwebs. I could feel the watchers closing in, their whispers turning into guttural growls. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench Gerald had left near the lens, and smashed the glowing light. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything stopped. Then the fog began to recede. The whispers faded, and the shadows outside the windows dissolved into nothingness. I stumbled back down the staircase, my legs trembling. Gerald was gone, and the lighthouse was eerily silent. By the time I made it outside, the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. The ocean was calm, the cliffs bathed in a golden glow. It was as if nothing had happened. But as I turned back to look at the lighthouse, I saw a figure standing in the lantern room, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the glass.